So in Shiver, we've got, again, a collection of short stories, and it goes from things like Used Record, which I thought was quite a good one. That's a good opener because it really doesn't indulge in the gore or the disturbing imagery. It's more of that conceptual horror where a girl, it's very, very simple, as you would expect with short stories. A girl ends up accidentally killing her friend after she attempts to steal a record from her, because this record has this enchanting song that you can't get anywhere else. It's very rare. There's no label on it. And it seems to cut in halfway through a recording. It's a woman's lone voice singing a cappella this haunting melody. And nobody knows where it came from and nobody knows what the record is of, but it seems to have an enchanting effect on the people who listen to the music that makes them obsess over it. So you have these themes of obsession, which tend to crop up a lot throughout Ito's work. It also has a particular theme in this one, which is that jazz is evil. Which I don't necessarily disagree with, because
what did he mean by this?
It's a jazz melody. Shockingly enough, none of Ito's stories, as far as I can tell, contain any diversity whatsoever. They're all Japanese.
One thing I will say about the record thing, obviously it's meant to be akin to a kind of siren song, something that is possessing people as soon as they hear it and driving them to listen to it endlessly and disregard human life and their own safety in order to pursue it. But it did remind me, and this happened after, I believe, the record story was put out. But did you ever hear about the Bjork Stalker?
I've heard of it, but refresh my memory.
So Dankula's done a fantastic video on it that is really unsettling. It's like watching a real life Joaquin Phoenix's Joker. This Hispanic heritage guy gets obsessed with Icelandic singer Bjork, who is quite neotenous. She's quite childlike, and she has a very similar voice to the one that's implied in the record story and then is actually sung in the adaptation. And it's almost like watching, over the course of him filming himself, getting obsessed with this woman and wanting to punish her with like an acid bomb for dating someone other than him, and then eventually killing himself. It's like watching a real life version of that. So the idea that someone can become so obsessed with a melody, particularly that strange, haunting, childlike melody that like Bjork would sing, or in that, to then drive them to hurt other people and themselves, it's unsettling, and it has happened. So Ito seems to be tapping into real and visceral and possible things. But that's why his body horror is so unsettling for me.
Well, he said in many interviews himself that his inspiration mainly comes from the everyday world around him, because there is so much mundane and almost monotonous things that we take for granted that you can find and, in a way, twist them into something unexpected, unusual, disturbing. And on that story that you just told, you've reminded me as well, it's slightly different, but still of the same character as what you described, was there was a band in the 90s called Pantera, who were a very famous heavy metal band. They split up in the year 2000 after releasing their last album. And then they all went their separate ways, and their guitarist and drummer, who were brothers, formed another band called Damage Plan. It turned out that there was an obsessive, crazy, schizophrenic fan of Pantera who had developed an obsession with them and also developed the delusion that they had been stealing musical ideas from his head. So that these ideas for riffs and songs would pop up in his head, and all of a sudden, oh, Pantera stole that from me. And so he thought that they were basically excavating his mind to steal ideas. And he went so crazy with this that when the band Damage Plan, the follow-up band, were playing, I think, near his town, he ends up going there with a gun and shoots Dimebag Darrell and a few other members of the audience, no other members of the band. He shoots Dimebag Darrell dead on stage, and I think he got took out by the security. So yeah, music has this really otherworldly and obsessive effect on a lot of people. It's one of the reasons that so many people love music so much, but it can be the danger that comes with any of these things that people really love artistically. And that's the interesting thing about the story, is that the song itself comes after the singer has died. She gets hit by a car, manages to drag herself into the studio that she was going to, and dies in the studio, and then begins singing the song. So it also taps into that idea that a lot of people have, certainly as a creative musical person myself, that you're not the one writing the music. You're a conduit that absorbs the music and these ideas from some otherworldly spiritual plane. But evidently, within this story, the music is coming from a malevolent force.
Well, there's also there's two things on that. One, you'll remember which band it was. Was it AC/DC that they accused if you played a certain song
Judas
backwards?
Priest.
Judas Priest, that was it. That they were inciting their followers to commit suicide or
That's
harm
happened with a
themselves.
few bands. Led Zeppelin, for instance, it was said that if you play Stairway to Heaven backwards, that you've got lyrics praising Satan. You can play the song backwards. I mean, it's not an enjoyable experience, but there's no secret messages there. Same with Judas Priest songs. Again, it's people putting their own interpretations onto these things and trying to draw it out into the real world.
Well, that kind of obsessiveness, particularly among groupies and teenage girl fans, manifested in things like Cuts for Bieber when we were growing up.
Oh, I remember that, yeah.
But then the other thing that you made me think of is that the idea that they have recorded her voice after she's died, that her death rattle can become some kind of melody that they can then monetize and sell on, has been the complaint of a lot of people in the music industry, that the music industry is exploitative. We only need to think of Michael Jackson, where Sony drove him to bankruptcy after he cancelled the Invincible tour because of the insensitivities of 9/11, Invincible being the most expensive record to have been produced at that time. And then after he dies, they quickly acquire his Elvis Beatles catalogue and his own catalogue and start releasing old tracks that he never wanted to put out, including remixing his songs for the Escape album with people like Justin Timberlake and augmenting his musical intent to keep profiting off of his corpse. And it's rather morbid, but it's something the music industry does do, and I think that hints at that in that story.
Yes, absolutely. And to expand on that point as well, with Michael Jackson, didn't they do the hologram tour?
They've done the
done
same thing for ABBA now as well, haven't they?
They've done,
They're obviously alive.
yeah, they've done the same thing for Ronnie James Dio. Tupac as well. It's very morbid. I can't imagine, if I'd been in the crowd, feeling comfortable watching essentially a shadow on the wall version of a dead artist going through the motions purely for the sake of monetizing the record labels who own their image. And with the music, it's the same. Frank Zappa, one of my favorite artists, he died in 1995, and I think more albums of his have been released since then than he released in his lifetime. And bear in mind, he released over 60 albums in his own lifetime. And all of this is throwaway, cutting room floor material that evidently, if he wanted releasing, he would have released. He released enough bloody material in his life to get out basically most of what he wanted out there. So I think that's interesting that such a short story we could draw so much from, but that's the effect of a horror, I think, especially short and condensed horror. And so, yeah, it's a nice, unsettling story. If we move on to the next one, the one that the collection is named after, Shiver, I think this touches on some themes that we'll talk about more with Gyo, because this was one of the more notable ones for me, if only because of the imagery that's used in it, which really hits on, I think it's trypophobia, the fear of holes, particularly holes in your own body, because one of the recurring visuals throughout this is that the main character is living next to a girl with holes all in her arms. What's got you smirking?
I have not had a fear of holes in many women's bodies before, Harry. I don't know what you're talking about.
I don't know. Maybe you're a braver man than I,
True.
Clearly. I mean, if it was on her arm, I'd be freaked out.
Yeah, pretty strange. No. The most disturbing part of this story is the granddad's diary when he starts describing all of the insects that are somehow linked to the jade carving crawling around inside him. That really unsettles me, yeah.
So it turns out the reason for it is that there's a cursed jade carving which has been thrown into the next door neighbor's garden, which has cursed their daughter. And the reason for that carving existing in the first place, if I recall, is because the grandfather during World War II managed to find it and kept a hold of it before he ended up dying due to it, and he ended up throwing it out of the window before he died because it was an affliction that nobody in the family could understand. And again, this will touch on more in Gyo, but it seems to relate back to the idea of World War II guilt. guilt over atrocities, guilt over crimes committed. The idea that an entire generation of Japanese men, in particular, were cursed through their involvement in the conflict, and that this is now being passed on to their descendants. And this does seem to be a pathology that affects quite a few Japanese people. Ito comments on it quite a bit, not in his interviews that I could see, although you might have seen some different interviews than I have. But it seems to go one of two ways in Japan, either a trauma relating to guilt or a trauma relating to the fire bombings and nuclear bombs that have been dropped. Because it's a theme that runs through a lot of manga and anime that I've seen. Akira starts with the nuclear bomb being dropped on New Tokyo. So in that universe, Tokyo had been nuked. They rebuilt it, and then it got nuked again. And it's all set after the fallout of that, because obviously being nuked does things to a country's mass psyche, especially one as conformist and as a collective in its culture as Japan. And then also, I've not watched it, but you've watched it, haven't you? Grave of the Fireflies.
There's all throughout Ghibli, there is a lot of nuclear annihilation imagery. You can go and watch my 2-part conversation with former employee John Wheatley there, where I was much more bright-eyed and bushy-tailed back in the day. But
weren't we all?
Yeah, quite. In Nausicaa Valley of the Wind, there are these ohms, these giant moving cephalopod-like bugs from prehistoric times that crawl over the nuclear wasteland eating radiation. And in order to defeat them, they resurrect the fire giants, an extinct race that can cause nuclear mushroom clouds to expand. In Totoro, famously, it's meant to be a sort of parallel 1960s Japan where the fallout of the war did not impact Japan and debilitate it as much, and actually they preserved the countryside rather than building on top of it to create places like Tokyo in the hills. And when they're cultivating trees, they grow them up to be the shape of the mushroom cloud. Grave of the Fireflies was an autobiographical text. It was adapted from a short story where the victims of the fire bombings of Japan, the sort of civilians who weren't involved in it, were 2 children whose mother was burned alive and sent to live with an aunt who didn't provide them enough rations. So they move out to an old war bunker, and you see the most harrowing, slow starvation of a young girl and eventually her older brother who dies in a train station holding her remains. I recommend everyone watch it. It's one of the best films I've ever seen.
No wonder everybody who's watched it has told me that it is harrowing.
Man, I cried. It's brutal. But it's even in the most optimistic of anime from Ghibli, because Grave of the Fireflies and Totoro released as a double billing. And depending on which way round you watch them...
Jesus Christ.
Yeah, it's the original Barbenheimer. It's brutal.
Because I've watched My Neighbor Totoro, and it's not a miserable film. It's quite a pleasant, fun, happy-go-lucky film.
It's basically got no plot. It's pure vibes. And it's pure, we're happy, it's like Alice in Wonderland.
If I remember, it's mainly about a little girl going to a bus stop near her home and finding that there is a big magical creature there who she becomes friends with. And that's the entire film.
They move to rural Japan and they discover in the bushes there is a giant friendly rabbit and a series of smaller other troll-like rabbits.
Even you just describing it is making me smile because it's so pleasant.
And then the other film they show it with is... Here's a 3-year-old girl who starves to death slowly because of the Japanese intervention in the war.
I'd rather have Fireflies first and then Totoro as a nice, palate cleanser.
I don't know. It would feel offensive if it was following it. But point being, the nuclear Armageddon looms large in the mind of the Japanese, and also the fire bombings of Tokyo, which claimed more lives overall.
More destructive.
Yeah, so it's not just the horrors of war that were inflicted on the civilians and bystanders, but also the guilt for the Japanese involving themselves in the war and the things that were done. And I think this story, particularly Shiver, it alludes to something that, and this is my conspiratorial hat on here, I don't know if Ito has a family secret of his own pertaining to the war. Because when we get onto Gyo, there was an interview that I read where he said that this was inspired by 2 things. Gyo was inspired by the shark attack scenes in Jaws and stories that his parents had told him about the war. And the submerged ship that was full of these plague-bearing mechanized
legs,
things that run on gas that hijack a
living creature,
deteriorating corpse. Yeah. This seems to have come from a Unit 731 mission that sought to load up biological weapons and send them at the US, but then the submarines ended up being sunk. Why would his family have necessarily known about that? It's the same thing of, is there a family secret here to do with things that were done during the war?
Well, he was born in the 60s, so I could hazard a guess that at the very least he'd probably have a grandfather, if not his own father, who was involved in the war on the Japanese side, of course.
And Unit 731 is by far the worst and most atrocious unit of the Japanese military. They subjected, I think it was 14,000 men, women, and children to vivisections, torture, various bodily experiments, seeing the effect of what frostbite does to living limbs, and then over 300,000 people total were killed by their biological weapons. And if that is the example it's based on, because it seems very similar, how would he have known if it wasn't a family story? And so the idea that there are family secrets following the war, and this is inflicted with a burden of being sworn to secrecy onto younger generations, like the girl who is born with these holes in her body that she's breathing through.
And she can't understand why, because nobody has told her, nobody even realizes the jade carving is in the garden.
Exactly. Nobody necessarily admits to the secrets lurking in your own backyard. Is this a personal thing for Ito? We don't actually know.
Well, we know in the same way that Nietzsche said that all philosophy is confession, in a certain way, all storytelling is confession, because as much as we can admit, and I do think that there's a lot of stock, put a lot of stock into what I described in the used record, that you are almost acting as a conduit for ideas that are being transmitted to you.
It's like the Geist idea that momentarily the gods might strike you with divine inspiration, and so the Roman poet must get it out here and now in case that inspiration flees from him before he can transcribe it.
If you would like to see the full version of this premium video, please head over to lotuseaters.com and subscribe to gain full access to all of our premium content.